This is The Long Way Around, written by Tommy Thompson. Chapter 1: Changes in Life's Direction. Eric Rockwell was not sure if the walls of the U.S. Navy's nuclear power training unit were painted gray, or if the endless rows of light bulbs had simply bled off all of the natural color of the world. Whatever it was, the distinction did not matter. The effect it had on the human mind was the same. It was a haze of sameness that pressed hard against his skull, flattening everything until even time had lost all of its edges. Days blurred into nights, lectures ran into drills, studying rolled into sleeping, with what seemed to be the only consistent things being the hum of electricity in the lights and the heavy weight of high expectations placed onto the students within. Eric was not the kind of man that anyone would have thought of as destined for this type of life. He stood tall, towering over the average American male at 6 feet 2 inches, topped with dirty blonde hair and a lean body structure from years of running soccer pitches and cross-country trails. His strength was average compared to someone who spent their summer months running around fields in the hot and humid South Carolina heat. His hair was once long and hung over his ears, but now it was short and within formal and strict naval regulations. He bore the face of openness, honesty, and trustworthiness with the kind of blue eyes that seemed more suited for a beach surrounded by friends, family, and fun than the sterile passageways of a naval training facility deep in the swamp of Goose Creek, South Carolina. His childhood was borderline ordinary, with a possibility to even cross over to forgettable. He grew up in a small town in eastern South Carolina, with one older sister who seemed to always be wearing one of his hoodies, a mother who would volunteer for double-shift duty at hospitals around birthdays and holidays, and a father who was always getting his hands greasy, whether it was in the garage or in the shop outback of their average modern family-style home in the standard nuclear family community. His weekends consisted of either his or his sister's tournaments or races, with evenings spent fishing at the local creek in town. There was no major trauma, no injuries that left defining scars, and no major relationships that allowed him to feel what loving someone outside of the immediate family felt like. The biggest danger he felt in his steady, rhythmic middle-class life was boredom. Boredom became the spark that drove him. As a basic A and B student, the college path after high school did not call upon him as it did others from his small town. There was something inside him that drove him to want more than just the same streets, the same stories, the same future as others. He wanted more than what other people seemed to want and settle into. One day, near his graduation from high school, recruiters from all the various branches of the U.S. military visited his class to talk about different opportunities each held within. Eric felt something inside him when the Navy recruiter began talking. He felt that the Navy was offering something that he was looking for, whether it was movement, a challenge, or a chance for him to prove that his life was more than just ordinary and average. When the recruiter began discussing the Navy Nuclear Propulsion Program, the toughest school in the world, even harder than Harvard, he felt a spark within his chest, a spark of something that had been missing but never knew it needed. He met with the recruiters in their local office the very next day and signed the papers to begin his new adventure. From there, he was sent to Great Lakes, Chicago, to begin Navy boot camp. After boot camp, he traded his previous normal life for a new one consisting of the hum of reactors, complex procedures, and fluorescent lights. The routine of the nuclear schoolwork came harsh to some. The classrooms reeked of overdone coffee with a linger of stale sweat. The combination of smells from caffeine and exhaustion clung to the air like static. The whiteboard-chalkboard combinations became a battlefield. Equations were scrawled in cramped spaces with handwriting that had seen better days. Neutron flux densities, moderator temperatures, power plots, and decay heat curves were scribbled into any space the instructor could find. Symbols, letters, and numbers twirled into shapes that looked more like witchcraft spells than instructions. Whoever the instructor was, it did not matter. All seemed to have little to no interest in legibility. This was not the normal style of teaching that many were accustomed to. This style of teaching was used as a filtration device, as a test to see who would break under pressure, and how much of that pressure they could take. Many say that Navy SEALs test their bodies to extreme limits, while the nuclear program of the U.S. Navy tests their sailors' minds. Eric scanned his classroom and noticed some classmates slouching in their hard, non-ergonomic chairs, while some were scribbling notes with frantic desperation. Others had hollow eyes, and their minds drifted somewhere between resignation and regret. There were a couple of sailors staring with a blank expression at the various boards, with their lips moving silently as they tried to decipher and decode what was being written by the instructor. The same could be seen no matter what classroom you looked into in that training facility. In every classroom, there always seemed to be one or two people who had given up completely, and they could be seen with their pens or pencils still, head down, and their souls somewhere else. Eric went back to his writing. His notebook was a grid of order in a world of chaos. To Eric, the words and numbers never lied. The words and numbers were his comfort. They would bend, they would twist, they would even dance on the edge of comprehension, but he would listen closely to his thoughts, and what he heard was the truth they told. This is one factor that sets him apart from the other students. He would not just memorize and recite equations and definitions. He would hear the pulse beneath them, listening to their heartbeat as a rhythm that felt like fission in his bones. One day, within the silence of the classroom, Petty Officer Rockwell, the instructor said, suddenly looking for an answer to a question that some did not even hear had been asked. The instructor's cadence was sharp, clipped and direct as if it had been an order and not simply a polite question. Without even looking up to the instructor, Eric recited clearly, crisply, and precisely with no hesitation. Negative temperature coefficient of reactivity for pressurized water reactors. Reactivity will decrease as temperature increases. They are inversely proportional to each other. It is a self-regulating passive safety feature. The already silent classroom somehow got quieter, Eric noticed. He could see his fellow classmates blinking at him as if he had just spoken a foreign language that no one knew or understood. Some scrambled to jot down his words, their pens moving fast as to chase a meaning of something they had not yet understood. Two of his classmates throw their pens down in defeat and slouch further into their chairs to show that they are overcome with disbelief, that someone could already be miles ahead of them. The instructor gave the barest of nods, an acknowledgement that meant more than just words. The instructor then turned back to face the boards and began to erase to move on as if nothing miraculous had just occurred. Eric let out a slow and shallow exhale. He is the type of person who does not need the praise and accolades. Instead, he is the type of person who needs the truth, and that truth was in the information and instruction that had been given to him. But beneath the precision, beneath the quiet pride, something was stirring. It was a question that he did not notice. It was a doubt he couldn't name. Could this be brilliance or could this be isolation? Eric continued to flip through his notebook and textbook, scanning the pages to view the next problem sets. There was no pausing in this program. There was no time to blink. Reactors do not care if you are tired, if you are emotional, if you are lonely. The only thing it cares about is the math and whether it is right or wrong. And Eric Rockwell never got the math wrong. The control room simulator glowed with sterile blues and greens. The panels were displaying information that hummed faintly like the breath of a sleeping beast, casting tiny halos of light across the console's gauges that blinked in a quiet rhythm. The simulator space was designed to be an identical replica of what real fleet sailors saw to control the world's most powerful submarines. The simulator holds a similar feeling as the reactor's beating heart, the nerve center of the power that commands the vessel that is buried beneath steel and the ocean's waters. That night, though, felt different to Eric. The control room felt tighter than it usually did, as if they were walking into a trap. Simulator runs are supposed to be minor controlled chaos, a safe atmosphere where young junior sailors can learn. Eric thought that this would not be a simple test of knowledge but a test of nerves. Eric was standing at his assigned station. His posture was straight, with his eyes roving between the various readouts. Around him were other trainees who were shifting uneasily, their movements stiff as if they were rehearsed but still somehow uncertain. The instructors had a cruel streak in their bones. They chose not to simulate routine operations, but instead, their choice was a catastrophe. The alarms in the control room rang to life, red lights overhead pulsing like arterial blood. Sirens screamed loudly, stretching the nerves of unexpecting sailors. The room transformed in an instant, nervous sailors shattered into panic. Chaos rose as a tidal wave that came crashing down over the trainees. One of the trainees slammed the wrong circuit breaker with a panicked hand, causing a cascade of other failures. Another trainee froze with their eyes locked on the panel. Shouts could be heard overlapping each other, commands being ordered in the wrong order. Voices rose until they sounded less like sailors and more like a crowd trying to escape a movie theater that had caught fire mid-showing. Eric, however, did not freeze. He narrowed the outside commotion, tuning out the noise. The sirens, the shouting, the flickering lights all faded into the background. The realm became data points, graphs, anomalies, and floating variables. The readings on the display for the coolant temperature and pressure did not fit the failure profile of what others thought the casualty was. There was a sliver of data that was minute but inconsistent. It was a deviation that was too subtle for those panicking to notice. Others were running around, no sense being made in how they made decisions, but Eric was calm, cool, and collected and trusted the training he received to understand what he was viewing. His hands moved with precision. Each switch and dial manipulation was a step in a puzzle that he was the only one to be able to notice and solve. He rerouted the system, adjusted flow rates, and stabilized pressure. His mind was steps ahead of the scenario, predicting next moves before they seemed to be ready to show. He was anticipating faults before they registered a new alarm. He was not going to wait for someone to give him orders. He knew what to do. By the time the student watch officer was ready to announce the casualty, Eric had already solved it. The alarms and lights were silenced. Calm clamped down over the control room like a lid on boiling water. Trainees breathed raggedly, sweat pouring from their heads, hearts still racing. Somewhere, standing at their consoles, stunned by what had just occurred. Others were looking at Eric, eyes wide open, unsure whether they should be grateful or afraid. Eric was sitting there in his chair, his pulse steady back down to a normal rhythm. To him, this was another procedure. To everyone else, this was impossible. The instructor stepped forward with a clipboard in his hand, but he did not speak. His gaze lingered on Eric, sharply assessing. He was not admiring what he just saw, but calculating something in his mind. He was looking at Eric as if he were not a student trainee, but a different kind of variable. He could either be a problem that needed to be solved or a weapon that could be aimed. Eric met his eyes, unflinching. He had seen that look before. Back in power school, in physics labs, in the eyes of the officers who did not know what to do with someone who did not break the way the others had. He was not the fastest in physical test, loudest or strongest, but when systems failed, when the pressure was mounting, when the room was in chaos, he was the one who stayed upright and calm. The instructor, with his pen now in his hand, scribbled something on a piece of paper, then turned away. No praise given, but also no reprimand. Eric believed this was going to be a negative note in some file that was going to follow him wherever he went. After the commotion had settled, the trainees began to reset their panels and acted as if what had just occurred did not actually happen. But it in fact had. Eric stood, stretched his fingers in front of him, and looked around the simulator. The lights were reset to their soft, humming glow. The room felt different now. a mood as if it had seen something that it was not supposed to see. From there, he walked out without saying a word to anyone. Outside, the night air was cool and damp, a heavy feeling of salt from the close harbor nearby. Charleston's small skyline blinked off in the distance, indifferent. Eric lit a cigarette with shaking fingers that he had not realized were shaking. He took a long drag and exhaled slowly. He did not need praise from others. He needed the truth, and tonight the data provided the truth. Heading for the exit of the facility, Eric expected freedom to taste like cheap beer and fried food. Maybe a few hours of forgetting all about the Navy inside some neon hole in the wall bar off of Ashley Phosphate Road. Instead, he found a man in a tailored, but still off-the-local department store rack suit leaning against his black sedan. Eric noticed this man's posture seemed to be too casual, as if the parking lot were his living room. "Petty Officer Rockwell," the man said smoothly with a low and even voice. Eric looked up strangely as the man knew his name, but he did not know his. The man was handing him a business card with a handwritten telephone number. There was no name, no identification, no hint of why the card was being handed to him. "You see patterns other people cannot see. Call this number when you think you are ready," the man said. Eric looked at the card without saying a word and handed it back to him. His time in the Navy so far had been short, but the countless trainings he had to take on operational security told him not to take the card. The man took the card back with a smile and placed it on the roof of Eric's car. Before he walked away, he looked Eric in the eyes and gave the card a nice tap. Eric continued to stare at the man as he walked away. The only noise was the man's footsteps and the cicadas buzzing staticky in the cool night air. He told himself that this was nothing and that he should not report it. It was just some nut job trying to act cool. Though there was something deep down, biting at Eric, he could feel it but just could not name it. The next day, the sun in Charleston rose like an alarm, flat and indifferent, spilling its light across the buildings of the training facility. Humidity clung to the air, turning the concrete passageways slick. The flag was barely stirring on the parade ground, heavy in the wet morning stillness. Trainees shuffled past, their heavy blue Navy working uniform already damp, clutching their notebooks and styrofoam coffee lifelines. The base was a machine of discipline. One would wake, march, study, test, and repeat it all over again. Eric moved through the masses as if he were another cog, steady and precise. But even as his body matched the rhythm of others, his mind worked differently. That is why he noticed the brochure out of place, and no one else seemed to care of its unusual position.